Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
It looks to me like what we need to do in our society as a whole is to be healers, to be those people who look realistically at the situation and say, what can I do to better the human situation? How can we create better harmony here in our particular country, given our history of racism as we've known it?
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Sister Pat Schnapp, an associate pastor at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of Christian responses to racism. Here's Father Bacik.
Pat, over the years I've always been impressed with your great concern for social justice. As one of the members of our staff at St. Thomas More, that is your particular area of activity, and I've always liked the way you have thrown yourself into it and puts forth such great emphasis and energy in trying to deal with the causes of our time and so on. And therefore, I thought we could talk about one aspect of the social justice concern during this program, and that is that of the problem of racism in our country and how we're going to deal with that. You ready to launch into one of your favorite topics?
Yes, I suppose I would have to credit for the beginning of consciousness raising on the issue of racism, of course, one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin. When I read his book, The Fire Next Time, about 20 years ago, I closed it feeling extremely depressed and feeling ashamed of being white and being Christian and being American. It's a devastating and powerfully written expose of the hypocrisy of the Christian churches and the way in which very often Christianity has been used as a tool of oppression historically with regard to the blacks in our own country. It took me a long time to somehow assimilate what he was saying, and it just left a powerful impression on me that has never gone away.
Right, and what impresses me, of course, is that it's moved you to action and to do what you can do to try to deal with that problem and to create more harmony among the races in the United States. It's given you, I think, a great feel and compassion and emotional set in dealing with that problem. And that's really, I think, what impresses me, the combination of compassion and constructive action that you've tried to deal in. I know you mentioned James Baldwin, and we had the privilege of spending some time with him on a couple different occasions in the recent past, and it was a very impressive situation, and I think one in which one begins to get a little bit of feel for the black situation in the United States, because you hear an articulate person speak about it in strong and graphic kinds of ways. I'm not so sure that everyone's going to end up agreeing with everything he says, but at least one gets a perspective on it that is usually blocked for the white people in the United States. So maybe we can talk a bit about that now. Some of the things I know that if I try to start to reconstruct some of his themes and so on, I remember one of the things that he was saying, that the black people in the United States really do know the white people, that they've been forced to do that they have had to learn how to make it in the white world. They've been an oppressed group ever since the days of slavery. and that even in the modern world or in contemporary times, they still have to be on alert to what white people are thinking and what's going on in the dominant culture. And he would often say it directly straightforward, you know, we know you. All black people know you white people. And I think that the other side of that I was getting from what he had to say was that, well, on the other hand, the white people have trouble facing the black people in the culture, have trouble facing them because they bring out to us some other side, a seamy past, a whole history of slavery, an enduring situation of oppression. Again, I'm just trying to paint what I remember from the conversations that we had with him. Maybe you can fill that in or take it in other directions.
One of Baldwin's favorite expressions, to sort of continue what you've been saying, is the expression, the willed innocence of whites. That is, our inability or our unwillingness to somehow acknowledge whatever part we have been of the problem of the oppression of blacks in our own country, the sort of rejection of our history. Although we embrace it in other areas, we reject it when it comes to what we have done to blacks and what we continue to do in perhaps more subtle ways even today. And he makes the rather interesting and paradoxical point that the loss of innocence is also the loss of guilt, that somehow it's only when we accept and open ourselves to the reality of our own guilt that then we can somehow work our way back toward being innocent. But as it is, we refuse to acknowledge our innocence, and therefore we remain imprisoned in our guilt.
You know what, I think that many white people hearing that kind of talk have an instinctive negative reaction. They equate it with something we might call collective guilt, and they'll say, hey, look, I never had any slaves, and I've never treated any black people badly in my own life, and I'm not prejudiced or biased in my own outlook, and therefore I don't want that guilt thrown on me. I can imagine people reacting that way to your opening statements about when you said after you read the fire next time. You know, and your comment was something about I felt ashamed to be a Christian and an American and so on. And I know that people would react negatively to that. And people say, no, I don't have any part in that collective guilt. Collective guilt doesn't make any sense as a concept. That guilt is more of a personal kind of responsibility. And they'll say, I didn't really do anything in that regard.
I guess I would answer that by saying that if we reject collective guilt, we're rejecting in some sense our solidarity with the rest of the human race. That in considering what was done, whether to the slaves here in the States, what continues to be done to black people in many situations, what's being done in a number of oppressive situations around the world, what was done to the Jews at Dachau and Auschwitz. Considering this is deeply, I think, should move me down to a consideration of the human capacity for evil, for hatred, for oppression. And unless I want to say that I stand outside of the human condition, I must acknowledge that I too, in some sense, have the same capacity, have this dark side in me. And I think because of my association as a member of the human family with my brothers and sisters who have perpetrated this oppression, I too feel ashamed and I feel guilty, just I suppose as I feel in some way guilty and bad about the fact that I'm a German American when I read about what happened to the Jews, because this was done by people who could well be my cousins, for instance.
Perhaps I think if we wanted to press the point, I think some people are still going to say, yeah, but that isn't my own emotional reaction to it. That isn't, I don't feel guilty about all of that. And maybe other people would be saying, well, that kind of guilt just would paralyze one. That it doesn't make any sense to feel guilty about that. And maybe if I was to try to pick that up, I guess I would move in the direction of saying that it looks to me like what we need to do in our society as a whole is to be healers, to be those people who look realistically at the situation and say, what can I do to better the human situation? How can we create better harmony here in our particular country given our history of racism as we've known it? In other words, maybe I would try to preach in that way or talk to myself in that way, get myself into action on the question along that lines, that I don't really feel the guilt or that way or the shame that you're talking about, but I do sense a responsibility to deal with a given situation. However it happened, we've got something like, over 40% unemployment among black teenagers in our large cities. You know, the economic reports that come out show that there is still a widening gap between the rich and the poor in this country, and that many of our black friends end up being among the poor in the country. And so maybe it would be more powerful, I don't want to say more powerful, but an alternate approach to people to say, hey, we've got this situation, whether we feel guilty about it or not, what we need to do is to work on it, to do something about it, to change it, to be the healers and the reconcilers. And that can't be just avoiding prejudice, but that would include doing something positive to create this harmony.
Okay. I guess I would just put in, and I acknowledge the point you just made, that guilt can affect us in a couple different ways. Certainly one is to debilitate us. We can become helpless. I think it can also be a catalyst for action. You know, I often, being the guilt expert on our staff, I think that a lot of things I do are motivated by guilt, and maybe that's bad in a way, and yet I think it has functioned well for me on a lot of occasions where my basic sloth would have kept me from doing a good thing that I was able to do.
Well, I think it's a balanced picture you give there, then, that people have mixed reactions, and that guilt can go in two directions. It can either paralyze or activate us, and probably for people who can use it positively, that seems like a good thing to do.
Yes.
But you know, maybe this guilt question goes a little further. I'm going back to a study I remember by Gordon Allport, the famous psychologist, a number of years ago, that said something like that the average churchgoer was more prejudiced than the average non-churchgoer. And I don't know if that study's been updated or whatever, but I have a suspicion that there's some truth in it, that we have an awful lot of prejudice lurking yet in our churches, that many people who go there regularly and worship God have not really reached a full sense of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all human beings. We're still walking around thinking that one group is inferior to another, or who still want to put down another group, or people who emotionally need a scapegoat, some other group that they look upon as inferior so that they can build themselves up. Again, I think that's one of the things I got from Baldwin, I think, that one of his own senses of how white people use black people. It is a way of saying, hey, we're not the lowest on the rung, or we're better somehow because we've got this other group that is inferior to us. So what I'm saying is that maybe this problem of responsibility and guilt is not so easily set aside as the other comments I made would suggest. That is, that there really is a lingering racism right within the religious world, and that we have to address that and deal with it.
I think it's a sad fact that very often people who are most religiously concerned about getting to church regularly also seem to have a certain smugness and self-righteousness about that very, religious attendance. And it first shocked me, and it still saddens me that this tends to be the case, that people who rank high on a religious scale often rank high on a bigotry scale. And yet maybe that's, an occupational disease, if you will, of religion, is that it suggests that we are the saved, we are the elect, we are the ones who are right in the sight of God. And if we don't see others behaving as we are behaving, somehow we feel we now have some sort of transcendental reason that justifies us in seeing them as in some way inferior to us. We think of the great unemployment of the blacks and the fixation that so many whites have on the importance of getting a job and being hardworking and taking care of our families and not getting on welfare and so on. And I can see again another reason that many people might have for continuing to feel a certain moral smugness and superiority.
I think that there is a theological outlook that has often perpetuated this whole thing that you're describing there, and that is, I picked it up with the welfare question. A lot of times people will say that those people living in the ghettos, which are often blacks in our culture,
yes,
are really lazy and no good and sinful people, and that's why they are in that situation. They are being punished by God for their sins. That's sort of what they deserve. And the correlative of that, of course, is that people who are living a nice, middle-class, comfortable existence really deserve that too, because they are good people. And I think that is a terrible myth, along with a lot of other myths about welfare, that all of these able-bodied people are simply cheating the government. I don't remember the exact statistics, but the vast majority on people
95%.
Who are on welfare, 95% are, well, they're either too young to work or too old or are disabled one way or another. And yet that whole idea keeps coming out all the time of a few welfare cheaters. Now, I don't think there's anybody in the country who doesn't know that the welfare system needs reforming in some way, and there ought to be better ways of doing it and more humane ways of proceeding and respect for people's dignity and so on. But the idea that the whole welfare system is based on people who are cheating, able-bodied men who could be working, I think is ridiculous. Well, what am I trying to get at? These myths that surround the poor and have attached themselves to the blacks in the country in different ways. And I think that really has to be broken through. And from a theological side, we have to challenge that within the churches and to do it strongly so that people can't use religion to prop up prejudice. And we know this when we preach on social justice questions, when racial matters come from the churches and from the pulpit, and when statements are made, it angers people. People will say, well, the church doesn't have any right to talk about those problems. And yet, I think what we're seeing today is that charity has an institutional side. Charity has to be political and economic, that to love other people means that we try to straighten out the situation, that we fight against unjust structures, that we try to challenge institutions which are oppressing people. It seems to me that we have to work in that direction, and that this idea of confining religion to the church or the sacristy or to 1 hour on Sunday morning simply goes against the whole message of Jesus Christ. In fact, it goes against the whole message of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which says that God is at work in the world and that we're supposed to spread the kingdom in the world and that we're supposed to make God's presence real, establish shalom, peace, and justice. So charity has to have this more social and economic side to it. And one of the things, therefore, we have to preach against is this idea of racism and the hidden prejudices that still seem to be so much a part of our church life in many ways. And maybe within ourselves, don't you think there's a personal examination that has to go on here as well? We can't just step back and be looking at others and trying to be saying, well, other people are prejudiced. I think all of us have our own bias and our own tendency to stereotype, and we'd really have to be in touch with that for ourselves. Or maybe, as you said before, the omissions, the failures to do when we ought to be involved.
I think that's true. I feel bad, for instance, when I cross the campus at Bowling Green and still sense that we are largely a segregated campus there, that blacks will tend to be walking with blacks and whites with whites. And I think we have to make positive efforts to create those situations where we deliberately work to see that we don't just perpetuate the segregation that has always existed within our own country. It's not going to happen automatically, and certainly a black would probably have all sorts of apprehensions about sitting down with whites if she or he were not deliberately invited to do so. I remember one time when I taught in high school that some teachers were making comments that the black students sat together at assembly and sort of segregated themselves from sitting with the white majority of students. And so I talked to a black student about that one time, and he said, I'll tell you. He said, we sit together because we know that we accept each other, something to this effect. And he said, besides, he said, I've got some friends who are white, but when I sit down on the floor with them, I feel like a spot, which I thought was a humorous and interesting way of reflecting on the fact that he would have been very, very much alone and separate from the friends that he knew he could count on being received by and liked by.
A lot of these things are built into the culture in which we live,
yes.
Aren't they? I mean,
yes.
I think we've got to remember that the problems are extremely complex. The history of it needs to be taken into consideration. I think that the whole destruction of the black family life, sort of systematically done during the times of slavery and keeping people deliberately in an illiterate status, all of that has to be factored in, I think. We're always the product of history, and that raises the whole question of affirmative action, I suppose, and from a Christian kind of framework, going the extra mile and doing the generous thing to try to better a situation which has really been created by a long history of racism and slavery. I'm wondering, about the television series Roots and what that did to people. I was out of the country when people were watching that, but got another chance to see it. And I think that really did have an effect on people. Many people had their consciousness raised, I think, at that time.
That certainly is true. I talked to some blacks who felt good about it being shown, somehow felt that their story was finally being put in front of their white brothers and sisters in an authentic way. And I also know of people in my own family who were deeply moved by the showing of Roots, and I think whose sensitivity to the fact that the problem endures was very much there. One of the comments of Baldwin's that I liked very much is that we can become somehow imprisoned in our own pettiness and in our own narrow fears, and that life is offered us on certain terms, that we both accept the terms and create the terms, and that we need to learn to make love with whatever it is that frightens us. And I
make
think
love with what frightens
to
us.
whatever it is that frightens us.
Mm-hmm.
To get in touch with something more than ourselves, to throw ourselves into a situation where we don't have time to weep. And he says that during the civil rights movement that he went south because he was afraid to go south, specifically because he was afraid to do that. And I often feel of the richness that I've experienced in my own life when I finally made some positive steps toward becoming acquainted with and finally becoming friends with some black people. And I suspect that there's a great richness that we're all missing out on if we limit our friendships, our acquaintanceships with those that we feel comfortable with because their background is very much like our own. If we aren't missing out on a lot. And certainly Baldwin would be one who would call us, I think, to get together, who feels that the whites and blacks who have had their consciences raised must get together and, like lovers, see if we can forge and achieve what America is supposed to be, what we have always claimed that we were.
That reminds one of Martin Luther King's great ringing statements about living out the American dream. He was not hesitant at all to call upon the best in our heritage and our official statements in order to move us towards more friendly racial relationships and equal opportunity for everyone. And I think that is something worth remembering, that it is built into our culture, in our statements of ideals at least, fundamental equality. And so this whole idea of living out the American dream seems to me to be a valuable way of approaching it, as we try to sort of spread the word that, you know, we've got to fight racism and make a better effort to create harmony in our country. There is not only our religious heritage, but our civil heritage as well. Our civil religion, in a way, has that positive element in it, that all people are created equal and that we need equal opportunity under the law, and that we have this dream in front of us of a harmonious society.
I think Baldwin would point out that a lot of the sort of perhaps oppression that we would maybe like to deny we are a part of is not so much the act of performing of a nasty act or the saying of a nasty word like nigger to a black person, but it can very often be simply the sort of ignoring of the existence of the other that we had talked about earlier. That very often evil is simply in the fact that we don't recognize the humanity of other persons, that we can be cold and we can look beyond them or through them, or in some way suggest that they aren't even worth our considering a part of the human family.
I don't think there's much pain that's worse than being treated as a non-person.
Right.
To feel as though one is a cipher in this world of ours. And I think that really is a hurtful kind of situation, and perhaps many of the blacks have felt that way precisely here in our United States. Pat, is there anything else you wanted to say about James Baldwin here before I launch into a sort of a final wrap-up of what we've been talking about?
I think James Baldwin would see the solution to all of our problems in our learning to love, and I think Baldwin himself has evolved toward a perhaps less abrasive judgment on religions because of the civil rights movement and seeing many religious leaders in the forefront of that. I think he would call us to even in the face of our fear of one another, to get to know and get to love one another, and he would find hope in the experience of human love.
I think that accords very well with our general Christian outlook. One of the things that we're pushing today is to see that Christianity has to make an impact in our world, that it has to deal with structures and systems as well as individuals, that charity can't be directed just one-on-one, although that's really important and we have to work at that. But what we're trying to see as well, that there's an institutional evil that pervades our world. There is such a thing as social sin that has to be addressed, that the evil and the greed and the selfishness of human beings gets embedded in our institutions. And I think we have to say, when we look at employment questions and income levels and so on, and opportunities for people, that the blacks simply have not arrived in our country. That dream is not real to them. We have to face that. And as Christian people, I think we have to say we need to address that in an institutional fashion as well. We have to make our institutions open to them. We have to make sure that the black community is welcomed into our churches. I think we have to fight the prejudice that still is in the mind of many Christian people. I mean, we have to form coalitions to work on the employment problems. We have to find opportunities for the young blacks in our society. And I think that all of that becomes an important dimension of the gospel. There is a social side to the Christian message. And surely if it has any meaning at all and is going to be real in our world, it has to attack this terrible evil that we call racism.